The small town of Millbrook had always prided itself on being a peaceful community where everyone knew their neighbors. The local police department sat in an old brick building on Main Street, its worn steps telling stories of decades gone by. But behind those weathered walls, a troubling situation had been brewing for years. Officer Reeves wasn't always the way he was now. When he first joined the force 15 years ago, his colleagues remembered him as an eager rookie with a bright smile and firm handshake. The older officers would often recall how he'd bring coffee for everyone during early morning shifts and volunteer for community outreach programs. But power, as they say, has a way of changing people. It started small, the way most troubling things do. A pushed shoulder here, a harsh word there, an unnecessary raised voice during routine traffic stops. His fellow officers noticed the changes but brushed them off as stress from the job. After all, police work wasn't easy, and everyone had their bad days. The first complaint came in during his third year. A local shop owner reported excessive force during a minor shoplifting incident. The paperwork mysteriously disappeared from the records room. By his fifth year, the complaints were becoming harder to ignore. A teenager with a broken wrist after being handcuffed too roughly. An elderly man pushed against his car during a speed violation stop. A young woman in tears after being aggressively questioned about a parking ticket. But Reeves had friends in high places. His uncle sat on the city council, and his weekend golf partners included the police chief and 2 senior sergeants. Each complaint was swept under the rug, each incident explained away with carefully worded reports and convenient witness statements. The system that was meant to protect the public had become a shield for its worst offender. The other officers saw what was happening. They'd exchange worried glances when Reeves would volunteer for certain patrols, especially in the quieter parts of town where fewer eyes were watching. Some of the younger officers tried to speak up, but they quickly learned that questioning Reeves meant getting the worst shifts and assignments. The old-timers just shook their heads, having seen this story play out before in other departments. The local newspaper ran a few stories about citizen complaints against the police department, but nothing specific could be proven. Reeves became more careful, more calculated. He learned which streets didn't have security cameras, which times of day had the fewest witnesses, and which people were least likely to be believed if they complained. The community started to feel the change too. Parents warned their children to be extra polite if Officer Reeves pulled them over. Shop owners would nervously glance at their phones when his patrol car parked outside. The sight of his badge, meant to bring comfort and security, instead brought anxiety and fear. What made it worse was how he'd behave at official functions. At police charity events or town hall meetings, Reeves was all smiles and charm. He'd pose for photos with local politicians, donate to children's hospitals, and give speeches about protecting and serving the community. This public face made it even harder for people to believe the whispered stories about his other side. The breaking point was approaching, though nobody knew it yet. As Reeves's sense of invulnerability grew, so did his boldness. He stopped trying to hide his contempt for department regulations. His body camera would mysteriously malfunction during controversial encounters. His patrol car's dashboard camera would be accidentally turned off during traffic stops that led to complaints. His fellow officers had become prisoners of their own silence. Each ignored incident, each dismissed complaint, each looked-away moment had built a wall of complicity that seemed impossible to break down. They knew something had to give, but nobody wanted to be the one to make the first move. The warm autumn was fading into a bitter winter, and the town of Millbrook was about to learn just how high the price of silence could be. All it would take was one traffic stop, one hidden camera, and one brave individual to bring the whole house of cards tumbling down. But on this particular morning, as Officer Reeves pinned his badge to his chest and checked his reflection in the mirror, he had no idea that his carefully constructed world was about to shatter. The morning started like any other in Millbrook. A light frost covered the ground, and the sun was just beginning to peek through the November clouds. People were heading to work, kids were walking to school, and Officer Reeves was starting his usual patrol route. Nobody could have known that this ordinary Tuesday would change everything. A young college student was driving his old Honda Civic, the one his parents had helped him buy for his studies. He was heading to the local university where he was studying computer engineering. His car wasn't fancy, but he kept it well maintained. a habit his mechanic father had instilled in him since childhood. The student had just finished an early morning study session at the library and was driving carefully, making sure to follow all traffic rules. He'd heard stories about Officer Reeves from other students and local residents. Everyone knew to be extra careful when that particular patrol car was around. The red and blue lights suddenly flashed in his rearview mirror. The student's heart sank. He knew he hadn't done anything wrong. He'd checked his car thoroughly just the day before, making sure everything was working perfectly. Still, he did exactly what his parents had taught him: turn on the interior light, keep hands visible on the steering wheel, and stay calm. Officer Reeves approached the car with his usual swagger, hand resting on his belt. "License and registration," he barked, not even bothering with a greeting. The student responded politely, moving slowly and deliberately as he reached for his documents. "Sir, may I ask why I'm being pulled over?" Broken taillight, Reeves snapped, though both of them knew this wasn't true. The student had checked all his lights just yesterday, but he stayed quiet, knowing from others' experiences that arguing would only make things worse. What happened next would later be described by witnesses as a disturbing abuse of power. A nearby coffee shop owner, opening up for the morning rush, saw it all unfold. Two high school students waiting for their bus captured parts of it on their phones. And most importantly, the student's dashboard camera was recording everything. Reeves began questioning the young man aggressively, his voice getting louder with each response. Despite the student's calm and respectful answers, Reeves seemed determined to escalate the situation. "Step out of the vehicle," he ordered, his hand now gripping his baton. The student, still trying to defuse the situation, asked in a steady voice, "Sir, have I done something wrong?" That simple question seemed to push Reeves over the edge. What followed was a display of unbridled aggression that would shock the conscience of the community. The coffee shop owner, unable to stay silent, stepped outside her store. "Is everything okay over there, officer?" she called out, trying to let both men know they were being watched. But Reeves was too far gone in his power trip to care about witnesses anymore. The student, despite his fear, managed to press the backup button on his dashboard camera, something his parents had insisted he learn how to do. Every word, every action, every abuse of power was being recorded in crystal clear quality. The scene that unfolded would later be described in courtrooms and news reports, but the raw emotion of the moment, the fear in the student's voice, the trembling hands of the witnesses recording on their phones, the helpless anger of the coffee shop owner, these would become part of Millbrook's collective memory. Several cars drove by, slowing down as they passed. Some drivers called 911, reporting an officer acting aggressively during a traffic stop. But help wouldn't arrive in time to prevent what was about to happen. The dashboard camera kept recording, its unblinking eye capturing every moment of Reeves's transformation from law enforcer to lawbreaker. As tensions escalated, the coffee shop owner convinced the high school students to step inside her shop for safety, but not before they had captured crucial footage on their phones. She then called the police station directly, asking for a supervisor to come to the scene immediately. The whole incident lasted less than 15 minutes, but its impact would echo through the community for years to come. Nobody who witnessed it would ever forget the sound of the student's calm voice turning to panic, the thud of the baton, or the sudden silence that followed. What Officer Reeves didn't realize, as he wrote his version of events in his official report later that morning, was that technology had finally caught up with him. The truth couldn't be buried this time. The dashboard camera had captured everything, every word, every action, every lie. And soon, the whole world would see exactly what kind of officer had been patrolling the streets of Millbrook. The truth has a way of coming to light, even in the darkest of situations. What Officer Reeves didn't know that morning was that the little black box mounted discreetly on the student's dashboard would become his undoing. The camera had been a graduation gift from parents who understood all too well the importance of having an unbiased witness on the road. The student's father, a mechanic who'd seen his fair share of injustice over the years, had spent extra money on a high-quality system. "It's not just about accidents," he told his son while installing it. "Sometimes you need proof of what really happened." Those words would prove more prophetic than either of them could have imagined. In the hospital, as doctors treated the student's injuries, his parents made a crucial decision. They wouldn't let this incident be buried like all the others. The father carefully removed the memory card from the dashboard camera, his hands shaking with a mixture of anger and purpose. His wife, a local high school teacher, backed up the footage to multiple secure locations before they even left the hospital. The video started normally enough, showing the morning drive, the flashing police lights, and the initial stop. But as it continued, the footage revealed a chilling transformation. The camera caught everything. The perfect working condition of all the car's lights, Reeves's aggressive approach, and the escalating situation. Most importantly, it captured crystal clear audio of every word spoken. "I've checked all my documentation, sir," the student could be heard saying calmly on the recording. The response from Reeves was telling. "I don't care what you checked. I'm the law here." The camera's microphone picked up every word, every threat, and every abuse of power that followed. Meanwhile, at the coffee shop across the street, the owner had been busy with her own documentation. Her hands trembled as she downloaded the footage from her store's security cameras, which had captured the incident from a different angle. The high school students who witnessed the event had also managed to record portions on their phones, creating a multi-angle view of the truth. The student's mother, who taught computer science, spent that evening carefully compiling all the video evidence. She synced the dashboard camera footage with the coffee shop's security video and the bystanders' phone recordings. The result was undeniable, a complete timeline showing every moment of Reeves's misconduct from multiple angles. What made the dashboard camera footage particularly damning was its quality. This wasn't grainy, distant footage that could be questioned or explained away. The high-definition video showed every detail, every expression, and every action in perfect clarity. The audio was equally clear, capturing every word exchanged during the encounter. The family's living room became a command center of sorts. The father contacted trusted friends in the community who had their own stories about Officer Reeves but had been afraid to speak up. The mother organized the digital evidence, making sure everything was properly backed up and time-stamped. Their son, still recovering, provided a detailed written statement of the events, while they were fresh in his memory. Local journalists who had tried for years to expose Reeves's behavior would later say that this footage was the smoking gun they'd been waiting for. Unlike previous incidents where it was one person's word against an officer's, this time there was irrefutable proof. The camera had caught what so many had experienced but couldn't prove. The footage also revealed something else, something that would become crucial in the investigation that followed. In the background of several shots, other officers could be seen arriving at the scene, their expressions a mix of concern and resignation. These images would later prove vital in breaking down the wall of silence within the department. As the family prepared to release the footage to the media, they knew they were about to start something big. The mother created multiple copies of all the evidence, storing them in different locations. The father reached out to civil rights organizations that had experience handling similar cases. They weren't just fighting for justice for their son anymore, they were fighting for every person who had ever been silenced by Officer Reeves. The dashboard camera, that simple piece of technology, had done more than just record an incident. It had captured a truth that could no longer be denied, buried, or explained away. In the end, it wasn't just about the technology, it was about a family's courage to use that evidence to stand up against years of unchecked power and abuse. As the sun set on that fateful day, the family sat together in their living room, the compiled footage ready to be shared with the world. They knew that once they took this step, there would be no going back. But as the student's father often said while working on cars in his shop, sometimes you have to take things apart completely before you can fix what's broken. Tomorrow, they would begin that process of dismantling years of injustice, one frame of video at a time. The video hit social media on a Wednesday morning. By Wednesday afternoon, the quiet town of Millbrook would never be the same. It started with a few local shares, then spread to neighboring communities, and within hours, major news networks were picking up the story. The truth about Officer Reeves had finally broken free from the confines of whispered conversations and buried complaints. The local coffee shop where part of the incident had been captured became an unexpected gathering place for the community. People came in just to look out the window at the spot where it had happened, sharing their own stories in hushed voices over steaming cups. The owner, who had witnessed the incident firsthand, found herself retelling the story countless times. "I always knew something would happen eventually," said one elderly customer, his hands wrapped around a coffee mug. "I've lived here 40 years, seen a lot of officers come and go, but that man, he was different." Others nodded in agreement, finally feeling safe enough to share their own encounters. The local high school became another hub of activity. Students who had witnessed the incident were being interviewed by news reporters, their young faces serious as they described what they'd seen. The student newspaper ran a special edition featuring stories from other young people who had encountered Officer Reeves over the years. Social media exploded with reactions. Local community groups that usually posted about bake sales and lost pets became forums for sharing experiences. One post from a former grocery store worker described how Reeves had harassed him during his night shifts. Another came from a retired teacher who had filed complaints that went nowhere. Each story added another piece to the puzzle of Reeves's years of misconduct. The town hall meeting that followed was unlike any in Millbrook's history. The usual monthly gathering that barely filled the first few rows now had people standing along the walls and spilling out into the parking lot. The mayor, who had always prided himself on running short, efficient meetings, knew this one would be different. "My son was pulled over by him last year," one mother stood up to say, her voice shaking. "I told him not to file a complaint because I was afraid of what might happen. I have to live with that guilt now." Her words opened a floodgate of similar confessions from other parents. The local newspaper, which had tried to investigate Reeves before but could never gather enough concrete evidence, now ran daily updates on the case. Their young reporters worked around the clock, following up on old complaints and interviewing former officers who had worked with Reeves. The paper's website crashed twice from the unprecedented traffic. Protests began forming in front of the police station, but they weren't the angry, violent demonstrations some had feared. Instead, they were organized, peaceful gatherings of families, students, and community leaders. People brought homemade signs sharing their stories. Others set up tables with information about police accountability and citizen rights. The student's family received an outpouring of support, their driveway filled with home-cooked meals from neighbors. Local businesses offered help with medical bills. A retired judge reached out to offer legal guidance. The community that had been silent for so long was finding its voice, and that voice was growing stronger every day. Even those who had previously supported Reeves found themselves questioning everything they thought they knew. The owner of the local diner, who had always given officers free coffee, watched the video with tears in his eyes. "That's not protecting and serving," he said, shaking his head. "That's just plain wrong." The police department itself was in chaos. Officers who had worked alongside Reeves for years now faced tough questions from their families and friends. Some defended him out of habit, but as more evidence emerged, those defenses grew weaker. Young officers, in particular, began speaking up about things they had witnessed but felt powerless to report. National civil rights organizations sent representatives to Millbrook, offering support and guidance to the community. They helped organize peaceful demonstrations and provided resources for citizens to learn about their rights. What had started as one incident was becoming a movement for change in the small town. As the week drew to a close, Millbrook had become the center of a national conversation about police accountability. News vans lined the main street and reporters conducted interviews on every corner. But more importantly, people were talking to each other, sharing stories that had been buried for years, and finding strength in their united voice. The student's dashboard camera had done more than expose one incident. It had broken down walls of silence that had stood for years. In coffee shops, at dinner tables, and on street corners, the people of Millbrook were finally having the conversations they had avoided for too long. Change was coming to their small town, and this time, there would be no turning back. They say the truth is like water, it always finds a way to flow. In the Millbrook Police Department, the dam of silence that had held back years of secrets was finally starting to crack. It began with the youngest officer on the force, barely 2 years into the job, who couldn't sleep after watching the dashboard camera footage. "I can't do this anymore," he told his wife late one night, sitting at their kitchen table. The next morning, he walked into the Internal Affairs office with a manila envelope full of notes he'd been keeping since his first day on the force. Every incident, every cover-up, every time he'd seen Reeves cross the line, it was all there in neat, dated entries. His actions sparked something unexpected within the department. A dispatcher came forward next, bringing audio recordings of concerning radio transmissions she'd saved over the years. I always knew someday someone would need to hear these, she explained, her hands steady as she handed over the files. The old-timers in the department watched these developments with a mix of fear and relief. One veteran officer, 3 months from retirement, sat at his desk staring at a locked drawer he hadn't opened in years. Inside were incident reports he'd been ordered to alter, civilian complaints that never made it to official records, and photographs that told stories nobody wanted to hear. I joined the force to help people, he told the Internal Affairs investigators, his voice thick with emotion as he finally emptied that drawer. Somewhere along the way, we forgot that. His testimony would prove crucial, providing dates and details that connected years of scattered incidents into a clear pattern of abuse. The police chief's secretary revealed how she'd been pressured to misfile certain complaints, ensuring they'd never reach the proper channels for investigation. She brought forward her personal diary, where she documented every suspicious request, every unusual order, and every time she'd been asked to look the other way. The department's computer technician spoke about how Reeves would always claim his body camera had malfunctioned during controversial encounters. But when I checked the equipment, there was never anything wrong with it, he explained. He knew exactly which buttons to press to stop the recording without leaving evidence of tampering. A retired officer, now living 2 towns over, drove back to Millbrook specifically to share his story. He described how, years ago, he tried to report Reeves's behavior to supervisors. Within weeks, he found himself assigned to the worst shifts, relegated to desk duty, and eventually pushed into early retirement. I've carried that guilt for years, he admitted. Maybe if I'd fought harder back then, none of this would have happened. The evidence didn't just come from within the department. A local mechanic revealed how Reeves would bring his patrol car in for maintenance after certain incidents, asking for dents to be fixed or interior damage to be repaired without official paperwork. The mechanic had kept his own records, including dates and descriptions of the damage, sensing that someday this information might be important. As more people came forward, a clear timeline began to emerge. The Internal Affairs investigators created a massive chart covering an entire wall of their office. Red strings connected incidents, testimonies, and evidence, revealing a pattern that stretched back through Reeves's entire career. Each new piece of information filled in another gap, answered another question, confirmed another suspicion. The most powerful testimony came from a former partner of Reeves who had transferred to another department years ago. I requested that transfer after what I saw him do to a teenager who was just walking home from school, he revealed. I told myself that leaving was the right thing to do, that I couldn't change anything by staying. Now I know I should have stayed and fought. The investigation revealed how thoroughly Reeves had manipulated the system. He had cultivated relationships with key people in the department, created a network of favors and threats, and built a wall of protection around himself that had seemed impenetrable. But now, as people found the courage to speak up, that wall was crumbling. Each day brought new revelations. Officers who had worked different shifts in different years began comparing notes. They discovered patterns in Reeves's behavior, specific locations where incidents often occurred, particular types of people he would target. The full picture was worse than anyone had imagined, but finally, the truth was coming to light. The blue wall of silence hadn't fallen in a single dramatic moment. Instead, it was dismantled piece by piece, story by story, truth by truth. Each person who came forward made it easier for the next one to find their courage. The trickle of information became a stream, and then a flood, washing away years of silence and complicity. The courthouse in Millbrook had stood for over 100 years, its brick walls having witnessed countless trials, but none quite like this. On the first day of Officer Reeves's trial, people began lining up outside at dawn, hours before the doors would open. The morning air was crisp, and coffee cups passed from hand to hand as strangers became friends, sharing their stories and hopes for justice. Inside the courtroom, the district attorney stood before the jury, his opening statement echoing through the hushed room. "This case is about more than one incident," he began, his voice steady and clear. "It's about a pattern of behavior that spanned years, protected by a system that lost its way. Today, we begin to make that right." The evidence was presented methodically, like pieces of a puzzle finally coming together. The dashboard camera footage played on screens throughout the courtroom, its crystal clear images impossible to deny. The student's family sat in the front row, holding hands, their presence a reminder of why this trial mattered so much. The coffee shop owner took the stand, describing what she'd witnessed that morning. Her voice shook slightly, but her words were firm. "I couldn't stay silent anymore," she testified. "Not after what I saw." The high school students who recorded phone videos spoke next, their young faces serious as they described the fear they felt watching the incident unfold. But it was the testimony from fellow officers that truly captured the jury's attention. One by one, they took the stand, many still in uniform, each adding another layer to the story. The young officer who'd first broken the silence described the culture of fear and intimidation. The veteran officer shared contents from his locked drawer, years of documented incidents finally seeing the light of day. The police technician explained in detail how body cameras worked, demonstrating how Reeves had deliberately disabled his device numerous times. The department secretary revealed the system of misfiling complaints, showing documentation she'd secretly kept. Each testimony built upon the last, creating an undeniable picture of years of abuse. During breaks in the trial, local news reporters interviewed people outside the courthouse. An elderly man who'd lived in Millbrook his whole life wiped tears from his eyes as he spoke. "I never thought I'd see this day," he said. "Finally, someone is being held accountable." The defense tried to paint Reeves as a dedicated officer working in difficult conditions. But their arguments fell apart when faced with the mountain of evidence. The dashboard camera footage played again and again, each viewing revealing new details that contradicted Reeves's official reports. Perhaps the most powerful moment came when the retired officer who'd been forced out years ago testified. He described watching young officers slowly change under Reeves's influence, how good people learned to look the other way. "We became part of the problem," he admitted, his voice heavy with regret. "By staying silent, we let this happen." The trial lasted 2 weeks, but it felt like the whole town held its breath for every minute of it. Local businesses closed early so owners could attend. Teachers used the trial as a lesson in civic responsibility. Students from the law school in the next town overfilled the back rows, taking detailed notes. The community support continued to grow. When the student's family arrived each morning, they found encouraging messages chalked on the courthouse steps. Local restaurants sent food to the courthouse for witnesses waiting to testify. A group of retired teachers organized a schedule to save seats for elderly residents who wanted to attend. As closing arguments approached, the atmosphere in the courtroom grew tense. The district attorney stood before the jury one last time, gesturing to the packed gallery behind him. "In this room," he said, "we have officers who found the courage to speak up, citizens who refused to look away, and a community that finally said enough. Now, we ask you to do your part." The jury's deliberation room became the focus of everyone's attention. People gathered in the courthouse hallways, on the front steps, in nearby coffee shops. Nobody wanted to be alone while waiting for the verdict. Strangers shared stories and hopes, their conversations a mix of nervous energy and cautious optimism. Throughout the trial, Reeves sat at the defense table, his once proud posture now slumped. The power he'd wielded for so long had evaporated in the face of truth. As each witness testified, as each piece of evidence was presented, the facade he'd maintained for years crumbled away, revealing the truth that everyone could finally see. When the jury foreman stood to deliver the verdict, you could hear a pin drop in the courtroom. 15 years, the same number of years Reeves had worn the badge he'd dishonored. As the judge read out the sentence, the courtroom remained silent, the weight of the moment too heavy for cheers or celebrations. The sentence reflects not just the crimes proven in this courtroom, the judge declared, his voice firm and clear, but the breach of public trust that these actions represent. When we give someone a badge and a gun, we give them our trust. That trust was not just broken, it was systematically abused for years. The student's father, sitting in the front row, squeezed his wife's hand. Their son, now recovered from his injuries, sat tall beside them. They weren't celebrating. This wasn't a moment for celebration. It was a moment of justice, of wrongs being made right, of a system finally working the way it was supposed to. Outside the courthouse, the crowd that had gathered to hear the verdict stood in respectful silence. An elderly woman who'd lived in Millbrook all her life wiped tears from her eyes. "My grandson can grow up in a different kind of town now," she whispered to the person next to her. "A better one." The changes in Millbrook began almost immediately. The new police chief, chosen after a nationwide search, stood on the steps of the station the next morning. "Starting today," she announced, "every officer in this department will wear a body camera. Every complaint will be investigated. Every citizen will be treated with respect. This isn't just a promise, it's our new standard." The department underwent a complete overhaul. New training programs were implemented, focusing on de-escalation techniques and community relations. The old system of internal investigations was replaced with a civilian oversight board. Monthly town hall meetings were established where citizens could voice concerns directly to police leadership. But perhaps the most significant changes were the smaller ones. Officers began walking their beats again, getting to know the people they served. Coffee shops and diners became places where citizens and police could talk openly about community issues. The wall between the police and the public started to come down, brick by brick. The young officer who'd first broken the silence was promoted to lead the department's new community outreach program. "We're rebuilding trust," he explained to a group of high school students. "Not with big gestures, but with small actions every day. Each positive interaction, each problem solved, each citizen helped. That's how we earn back the community's faith." The student whose dashboard camera had exposed the truth graduated from college with honors. He chose to stay in Millbrook, taking a job teaching computer science at the local high school. "Sometimes standing up for what's right comes with a cost," he told his students. "But staying silent has an even bigger cost." The coffee shop owner who'd witnessed the original incident turned her store into an unofficial community center. Police officers and citizens would gather there for informal meetings, breaking down barriers over cups of coffee. "It's amazing what can happen," she often said, "when people just talk to each other." Reeves's former partner, who had testified against him, became an advocate for police reform. He traveled to other departments, sharing Millbrook's story as a warning and a lesson. "It's not enough to be a good officer yourself," he would tell them. "You have to be brave enough to speak up when you see something wrong." The courthouse steps where people had gathered during the trial became a symbol of change. Every year, on the anniversary of the verdict, the community would gather there, not to remember the bad times, but to celebrate how far they'd come. Children would play on those steps while their parents chatted with police officers. No fear, no tension, just people sharing a community. The retired judge who had sentenced Reeves gave one final interview before leaving the bench. "What happened in Millbrook wasn't just about punishing one bad officer," he explained. "It was about a community finding its voice, about good people choosing to do the right thing, about a system remembering its true purpose." As years passed, Millbrook became known not for the scandal that had rocked it, but for the changes that followed. Police departments from across the country sent representatives to learn from their example. The dashboard camera footage that had started it all became a teaching tool in police academies, a powerful reminder of why accountability matters. The story of Millbrook became more than just a cautionary tale, it became a blueprint for change. It showed that justice, while sometimes slow, could still prevail. That good people, when they find their courage, can make a difference. That even the strongest walls of silence can fall when enough voices speak up.